Hi guys, just a wee quick run through of a paper two, just to show you, just to remind you what it is you're expected to do in paper two. This is paper two from 2023, and we'll just take a wee run through it. Okay, so the paper itself is an hour and 15 minutes. Tomorrow morning you're in at 9:15, so you will be out of there at 10:30. Okay. Um, there's 60 marks for the paper, so that's roughly a minute and a bit, a minute and a quarter, a minute and 15 seconds for each mark. Okay, so just use that idea to keep you on time. Um, question one has 4 marks, so roughly about 4 or 5 minutes. Don't waste any more time on that. You should be finished this in 5 minutes. Question one says, what does source A tell us about? What does source A tell us about? It doesn't say anything about contextual knowledge, so source A tells us that, and you need to be picking wee snips from the source, like Stalin was a suspicious man, or he used violence, force, and torture, or he carried out crimes. There you are, carried out crimes. So things like that, you're picking out. Source A tells us that Khrushchev thinks that Stalin was this, Stalin was that, da da da. Try and pick 2, 3 things out of the source that it tells us about that issue. Question two uses these two sources, source B and source C. And the first part of question two says, explain 2 ways in which these views are different. So it says source B and C give different views about the events in Hungary. Explain 2 ways they're different. Now remember about the 2 ways. Source A or source B says da da da, whereas C says da da da. And then remember, for the second one, you can say source B mentions dum dum dum, whereas C doesn't. And that's enough to get you the 4 marks. So its focus here is on content, what the source says. Okay. For the second part of the question, it says explain one reason why the sources are different. That's very, very different. Here you're talking about the authors. Okay. Because they will be from 2 different people with 2 different views about the same event. So say, for example, it was the Vietnam War. You might have an American view and a Vietnamese view. So these sources have different views because one is from an American who supports what America was doing in the Vietnam War, whereas the other source is from a Vietnamese communist who was opposed to what the Americans were doing during the war. Okay, and you've that extra space there to do that. You might need that for that one. Remember, to get the 2 marks, you must explain why they have different views. You just can't say they have different views because one is an American and one is Vietnamese. That's not enough to get 2 marks. That'll get you 1. Okay, to get 2, you need to explain a wee bit more. Right, on to question 3. Question 3 is, how convincing is the view in source D? So you get source D, which has a viewpoint about something. Okay, this one was about Dubček and Brezhnev, so it's about the Czechoslovakian uprising. You've got 8 marks, which means you've got roughly about 10, maybe 11 minutes. How convincing is the view? So here you have to bring in your contextual knowledge. Explain your answer using the source and your contextual knowledge. So in this type of answer, you should be writing something along the lines of source D says, whatever the view in the source D is. And then you say, I find this convincing because. And then that's where you bring in your own contextual knowledge. So say, for example, this was talking about the terrible living standards in Czechoslovakia. Source D says that Czechoslovakia was facing terrible living standards. I find this convincing because from my own knowledge, I know that the Soviets were taking goods out of Czechoslovakia to give to the Russians, to give to Russian people. Okay? There you've used the source and you've brought in your contextual knowledge. Now try and do that about 3 or 4 times, okay? But also, don't just say it's convincing because it's convincing because it's convincing because. Maybe there's something in it that's not convincing. So make sure you try and do that as well and say, source D says whatever it is, and I'm not convinced by this because, okay? So try and do that 3, maybe 4 times, okay? Times 3, maybe. And then try and do an overall. Overall, no, like a conclusion. Overall, I find this view to be convincing. And you can do a wee because dot 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 just to round it off, okay? Now that is a lot to do in that space, especially for somebody with big handwriting. So get extra paper if you're one of those people who can write a lot and writes quickly and writes with big handwriting. Get yourself extra paper before we start. Right, question 7, and I've put on a wee picture down here, is the ice fog question. I'll just see if I can make that wee thing bigger. If you remember ice fog, that's my lovely handmade poster from the classroom. The ice fog question, where you have to look at, ice fog stands for interpretation, content, explain the view, and your own knowledge, okay? So it's in question, just to give you the timings for this as well before we start looking at it, there's 16 marks for this, okay? So roughly spend about 20 minutes on that question. So the ice fog question, it says, how far would you agree with the view in source D that the countries behind the Iron Curtain had terrible living standards? Start with source D, okay? And what you should be doing is going through the steps of the ice fog there, okay? So just bring us down a wee bit. And you'd say, the view in source D is, sorry, I'm messing about with pens here. So the view in source D is, so what does source view, what does source D say? Give some examples of what it says. So include content from the source. So the source goes on to say, it tells us that. It goes on to mention, that's the type of thing you should be saying. Then explain the view, EV. So the source has this view because. Now, it might be because it's from an American, or it's from a Soviet, or it's from a Vietnamese, or whatever it is. And then, own contextual knowledge. From my own knowledge, I know. And explain what you know about what the source is talking about from your own knowledge. So you've got those 3 things to do. The I here is interpretation. In other words, what is the view? Now you do that times 3. So once you finish that about source D, you move on then and look at source B and C and do the exact same thing. The view in source B is, in source B it tells us that. Then you explain the view, you say, source B has this view because it's written by whoever it's written by, and from my own knowledge I know. And once you finish source B, then you go on to source C and you say, the view in source C is that. The reason why, the view in source C is that, blah, blah, blah. Source C tells us that, blah, 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 blah. The reason why it has this view is, and explain why it has the view. And then finally, from my own knowledge, I know that, blah, 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 blah. So make sure you're working through that ice fog for that question and picking up those 16 marks. That is the question where some of you really fell down on in your mock Christmas, okay? So that's the one that we practiced a lot in class. Again, I'm running through this very, very quickly, but we spent lots of time looking at this in class, and if you were in class, you should know how to do this. There's quite a bit of space given for that answer, but again, if you're a bigger handwriter, you might need more room than that. Right, then in this section B, we've moved off the sources now, okay? And in this section B, you have a question like this: describe 2 reasons why. So it could be 2 reasons for, well, this one's the September 11th attacks, 2 reasons for the building of the Berlin Wall, 2 reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, 2 reasons for the Czechoslovakian uprising. Anything, okay? It could be anything. I don't know what it is. Just don't leave it blank. put something in, okay? Then we're under our essays, okay? So the essays are question 6, and there's 22 marks, so leave roughly about 25 minutes for this. And again, remember about the essays that this up here is the question, okay? Here and here, and you've got a choice. You can do either one, the top one or the bottom one. That's the question. These things here are just there to help you guidelines. Think about it like a writing plan or a writing scaffold, okay, that you might have used in English or something else. So, but treat these like paragraphs, okay? Paragraphs in your answer, but this is the question. So you should start off by reference to the question. So your introduction should say, for this one, the question is, explain how events in Europe affected relationships between the USA and the USSR, 1945 to 1949. So your answer should start, events in Europe affected the relationship between the USA and the USSR in a number of ways. And then start off with Iron Curtain. The first problem was the USSR's fears and the Iron Curtain. The USSR was afraid that as they were the only communist country in the world, that they would be attacked by the West. This is why Stalin wanted control of countries in Eastern Europe. Between 1945 and 1949, Stalin, through a process of salami slicing, took control of the countries like West or East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on. You understand? And you talk about the development of the Iron Curtain, okay? Then you move on to look at the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine was that it was the role of the United States to stop any more countries falling to communism. The way they would do this is by pumping money into these countries through the Marshall Plan. So again, just explain it. And then finally, the arguments over Berlin and how that leads to a situation where Stalin closes off West Berlin and forces the Allies to fly goods in for a period of 11 months. So it's an essay based on this question up here. Don't see it as 3 different questions, 3 different things to write about. These are just actually guidelines, okay? So but just make sure you cover all the guidelines, okay? Do not leave any out. All right, and we had a look in class at the questions that were asked in previous years, and I think last year the big question 6 was about the early part of the Cold War. So it was about the Berlin airlift, and it was about takeover of Eastern Europe and so on. And the second question was about Korea and Vietnam. So it's unlikely that those questions will be asked again this year. Go into Google Classroom, scroll down, have a look at what the big questions were last year, and make sure that you prepare well for the places which weren't asked last year. But that's it, guys. Jump through the hoops. Just remember, 2/3 of this paper are for source questions. And for most of those source questions, you do not need contextual knowledge. So you jump through the hoops and do it the way I told you to do it, and you will maximize your chances of success. For the essay questions, just blurt out as much information as you know about the events that are in it. Remember, I gave you a booklet with all these essay questions done on it. Just read over them, read, and get out as much as you can out of your head onto the paper tomorrow. Write. Keep writing to the last minute, okay? And make sure you get the paper finished. Okay, best of luck, and if you see this and you're watching this to this point, come up and see me tomorrow after the exam and let me know how you got on. All the best.